This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture. Welcome to the City of God podcast, where we are weekly talking about today's biggest cultural issues, all through the lens of God's infallible word. My name is Rob Pacienza, and as always, I am joined by my good friend and co-host, John Rabe. John, great to see you.
Great to see you, Rob. It's always a pleasure to be together to talk to the fantastic guests that we have here on the City of God podcast. And today is no exception. We are introducing an interview with a good friend of ours. There's a lot that we've been seeing. You and I on this podcast talk a lot about critical theory and the way that Marxist critical theory has worked its way into our culture. And sometimes people will be like, oh, come on. No, you really start to see it. It's happening possibly at your workplace. If you have a DEI office, a diversity, equity, and inclusion office where you work, that's critical theory actually being put into practice. The accusation is made for basically anyone who has a conservative or Christian point of view. Well, you're a racist. And that's one of the ways that discussion is shut down, to just try to label you, you're phobic, you're racist, you're homophobic, you're transphobic. We'll just turn it into some pathology and then we can shut you up. But the reality is that these are things that are manifestations of critical theory. They are themselves racist and divisive. The Supreme Court this summer made a massive decision this past summer overturning what was race-based selection on the parts of universities in their admissions process. A huge step towards removing these artificial categories as major categories in our culture, and yet it's raised a war. And we have we have somebody who's extremely well qualified to talk about.
Absolutely, nobody better to talk to than Dr. Carol Swain, who spent her whole career in academia, and she has spent this next season of her life, now that she's out of the university system, which I think she's grateful for, no longer at Vanderbilt University, but now she's spending her career talking about discrimination. She's talking about race issues. She's talking about affirmative action, but all from a biblical worldview,
yes,
exposing that the modern social justice movement is nothing more than another attempt to reinvent Marxism, to reintroduce Marxism into the public square. And she has done a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of writing on this topic. And her new book, which is The Adversity of Diversity, is just come out. And we have the opportunity to talk to her about what led her to write that book and why it's important, particularly for Christians in North America.
And we talked to her a little bit about her personal story, her personal journey, because it's really important to this discussion. Carol herself is an African-American woman from essentially an impoverished background who has made it to the point where she was a professor at Princeton, a law professor at Vanderbilt University, extremely accomplished, and also able to step back and examine these issues from a biblical point of view and see that the things that are being put in place supposedly to increase diversity are, in one sense, a very surface level diversity, but actually result in division and battle, which is what we see all around us today, and helps us point the way forward to better ways of doing these things, which is not by identifying everybody first and foremost by their intersectional characteristics, race, sexuality, gender, etc.
Absolutely. So we'll have an opportunity to explore her new book, talk about affirmative action, talk to her about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that we are seeing in all over North America, whether it's in corporate America or in the university system. Carol Swain is a regular contributor to our ministries, both Coleridge Ministries and also the Institute for Faith and Culture, where she serves as a senior fellow. So without further ado, here is our interview with Dr. Carol Swain. We've got the great Dr. Carol Swain with us on the City of God podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Now, you are actually, I'll just let our listeners know, as we're recording this, Dr. Swain is down in Fort Lauderdale, getting ready to teach a course on cultural Marxism with the Institute for Faith and Culture. So we are really looking forward to this weekend and what you have to say about this important topic.
I'm excited about this topic, and the progressives say that there's no such thing as cultural Marxism. And the last few years I was teaching at Vanderbilt University. If you were to Google cultural Marxism, you'd get articles about cultural Marxism. And now that mostly they say it doesn't exist. So we can call it neo-Marxism. I don't care if they call it neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. That's what I'm going to be teaching about this weekend. And I'm excited because it's my first time teaching since I left Vanderbilt.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Well, we're blessed to have you down here. And you just wrote a new book, The Adversity of Diversity. I had the privilege of reading an advanced copy of it and offering my endorsement to it. Just such a important word from you for people to really wake up to what's happening in this conversation regarding diversity. What led you to write this book? And share with our audience a little bit about what this book is about.
Well, first of all, I have been grappling with those ideas about diversity training being off the rails a long time ago. Back maybe 5 years ago, I had a book manuscript, Why Diversity Training is All Wrong. And that book argued that the approach that was being used actually got the opposite of what they said, and it led corporations to get rid of their best talent, and that it was off the rails back 5 years ago. And I abandoned that project. And one of the contributions of this new book is that it ties together the connection between affirmative action, critical race theory, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And sometimes people like to think of affirmative action as being totally separate from DEI and CRT, and that's not the case. And what led me to write it was when the U.S. Supreme Court took the cases from the University of North Carolina and Harvard, the Asian students that were challenging race-based affirmative action. I knew that was significant, but I also felt that the court had to strike down race-based affirmative action because DEI and CRT had become so aggressive that they clearly violated the Constitution and Equal Protection Clause, and that if the court had not struck down race-based affirmative action, I didn't see a way that you could end the racism and what was taking place with DEI and CRT. And so the book argues that DEI violates the Constitution and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the same way as race-based affirmative action, and that it's really on life support. And so part of what this book does is give people the information they need to help pull the plug.
That's great.
And Dr. Swain, we always appreciate you being with us. You're always great to our ministry. And particularly today, I have to say, people who are listening and watching, they're not here in the room. And people need to know what a trooper you are, because it is, Rob, what would you say, 85 degrees in this room right now?
At least.
And it is hot, it is humid, and you've persevered to be with us, and we appreciate that. The book is extraordinarily well timed because of that court case that you referred to. But let's lay down a little bit of the groundwork, if you would. Those are words that people are used to thinking of as good things: diversity, equity, inclusion. Who's against diversity, equity, inclusion? But when we talk about DEI as it's applied to schools, as it's applied to corporations, as it's applied to institutions, there's a particular meaning and agenda that's in diversity, equity, and inclusion, isn't there?
It is. And before we actually get to those definitions, the chapter 2 of that book talks about my own journey in an affirmative action infused world. I don't remember the exact title. But part of my story is I was a high school dropout, one of 12, born and raised in rural poverty. And I got a high school equivalency and went to a community college and got the first of 5 college and university degrees. And, people steered me and pushed me and basically recruited me into academia. And so I have experienced all these things. And one of the criticisms that some people might want to say is, you benefited from race-based affirmative action, you're trying to pull up the ladder. one of the main arguments of the book is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that ended discrimination on the basis of race, sex, creed, religion, and the various things, and now disability, back in 1964, we got it right. And I would say I benefited from a change in society where they actively recruited talented minorities from groups that had been left out because of discrimination. And then, so you had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which I think most Americans came together. 80% of Republicans supported that legislation, more than, I think about 70% of Democrats, even though Democrats filibustered it. They had the longest filibuster in history over that Civil Rights Act. But I think Americans came together in the 1960s. They wanted a colorblind society. So 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act passed, prohibiting discrimination in numerous areas. Then 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed. 1968, the Open Housing Act passed, ending discrimination. So we were equal under the law. And then affirmative action, that was never a law that was passed by both houses of Congress and signed by a president. That was executive orders starting with John Kennedy. And at the time he issued the first executive order about affirmative action, it needed to be done because there was discrimination. It applied to federal contractors. Then we had the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That should have been enough, but then Lyndon Johnson was elected. 1965, he gave the famous Howard University commencement address where he gave the imagery of the shackled runner, that you don't take a shackled runner, bring them to the front of a line, tell them to compete with all the rest and believe you've been fair. And so he brought in the preferential treatment part. The Civil Rights Act of the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s, there were never demands for racial preferences or quotas. It was about non-discrimination and equal opportunity. And that was the goals. But what happened was white male elites from the Democrat side and the Republican side. In fact, it was Richard Nixon that brought us quotas. They were the ones that pushed because after the riots, long before you all were born, of the 1960s, people felt that progress wasn't happening fast enough. And so they moved to preferential treatments, which really benefited a lot of the better off minorities. And even now, with the race-based college admissions, the main beneficiaries have been immigrant blacks and blacks from more affluent backgrounds. And so that's how we got from what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was trying to accomplish to the quota and affirmative action regime. And back in the 1970s and 80s too, diversity used to mean diversity programs or whatever. It used to be that in the Office of Affirmative Action, and every major institution had an affirmative action division, they would send out recruiters, and they would go to historically black or Hispanic or Native American colleges and universities, and they would seek talented individuals or women. And so that's what diversity used to mean, bringing people into these institutions. But once they got there, they were supposed to compete with everyone else. And I always say that I benefited from the non-discrimination, the equal opportunity, and the recruitment. And once you got recruited into institutions, you could you had an equal opportunity to fail. And so many people failed along the way. So that's what diversity used to mean. Today, it means bringing in people as members of discrete groups and them retaining their group identity, them setting up affinity groups within the institution. And in my day, we sought integration, bring in racial and ethnic minorities. They became part of the whole. They became part of the team. With diversity and inclusion, they want people to come in, and it's a lot about feelings, to feel that they are included, to feel comfortable. And, you know, when you're dealing with somebody's brain and their emotions, how can you you can't guarantee how anyone's going to feel,
right?
Especially a young person, because I remember when I was young, you go through a range of emotions,
sure.
And someone doesn't speak to you, and you wonder if they're upset with you. You have all of these thoughts, but inclusion is not the same as integration. And in my day, equal opportunity meant you got your foot in the door, you had an equal opportunity to succeed or fail. Today, they want equity. Equal outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so that's diversity, equity, and inclusion is not the same as the diversity of the 1970s and 80s. The inclusion is not the same as integration. The equity is not the same as equal opportunity. And these new concepts are rooted in Marxism, in the cultural Marxism, a neo-Marxism, and they're closely related to critical race theory, and they are a layer on top of affirmative action that's far more aggressive, and it doesn't even pay lip service to the law.
Absolutely. Yeah. Instead of the class warfare of Karl Marx, we've just replaced it with race warfare, gender warfare. I mean, just constantly pitting groups against each other, all in the name of what you just said, equity, which is not equal opportunities, it's equal outcomes. I think that's an important distinction. Now, this book, The Adversity of Diversity, is timely because it was released just after a significant Supreme Court decision striking down race-based discrimination. Tell us a little bit about that decision and your thoughts on the conclusion of the Supreme Court.
Okay, the book is timely because 90% of it was written before the decision, and the 10% had to wait for the decision. And
Wow.
there was always the possibility that the court would get it wrong, not strike it down, and then the whole book would have had to be rewritten.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't, it might have been less interesting, but it would be about how the Supreme Court missed an opportunity. And the cases that came out of Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, they challenged the quota systems that many elite institutions have set up that worked against Asian students in the same way that they had quotas against Jews at one point. And the Asian students tend to be the highest scoring students, and it's because they work the hardest. There have been studies to show that Asian students study more than any other group. So if you look at students by the amount of time they spend studying, Asians at the top, Caucasians are second, then maybe Hispanics, then maybe blacks at the bottom. Blacks spend the least amount of time studying, even no matter if they come from higher socioeconomic status. They spend more time watching TV, and that accounts for some of the disparities. But the Asian students brought that lawsuit, and what we find today with progressives is that they have no problem discriminating against white people because they're white, or Asians because they're successful. And so the Supreme Court made the right decision. And they have also taken a case, and I don't know the name of that case, involving the K through 12 education that they will probably rule on next year, because there were some elite schools. I think one might be the Boston Latin School, where you had to meet certain criteria to get in. They had admission standards, admission tests, competitive tests for K through 12 kids to enter these schools. Well, they have relaxed the standards to such a degree that it's much harder to have standards at those institutions. So that's being challenged.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And as you deal with these issues, you have your own personal experience as well. And you talked about the accusation that's made. And Clarence Thomas gets this same thing, of course, who was very important in the decision we're talking about. Clarence Thomas gets the same thing. Oh, you benefited from all this, and now you want to pull the ladder up behind you. To me, President George W. Bush, 20 years ago, made a remark that has always stuck with me that I think is really telling. He talked about what he called the soft bigotry of low expectations. And it seemed, you're a very accomplished woman. You're a law professor. You were a law professor at Vanderbilt, professor at Princeton, and what ends up happening is that the accomplishments of someone like you, the accomplishments of someone like Clarence Thomas end up being diminished by the same people who claim that they're offering some sort of gift, because the subtle accusation is you didn't really earn it. You didn't really merit it. This was a gift from us, which is really sort of more racist than any of the things they're accusing the rest of us of.
And there's no way you can defend yourself against it. And that includes white women. So white women, because they are one of the beneficiaries of the Civil Rights Act. In fact, some studies would say that they were the main beneficiaries of the Civil Rights Act, so they were the ones that got in first. There's no way you can defend yourself, but when I think about my accomplishments, I was a high school dropout, GED, but I went to a community college. You didn't even need a GED to get into that community college. And I took remedial math, but I graduated with a 2-year degree in business in 2 years. And while I was there, I was hired by the community college library, full-time job with state benefits, nights and weekends. And I wanted to be a store manager. Started applying for jobs, and I was told I needed a 4-year degree. I decided that I also needed stronger applications. I had made the dean's list a couple of times, but I actually purchased and checked out books on how to make A's in college, how to take essay exams, how to do objective tests. I applied the principles, and I graduated magna cum laude from a 4-year college that probably had 20 blacks, and I won the criminal justice prize. That was my major. And I had colleges and universities all across the country trying to recruit me. And at that time, when I was graduating my 4-year degree, I decided that I didn't want a criminal justice career, that I was going to work for the government. Went to Virginia Tech, and while I was there, my professors put a lot of pressure on me to continue my education. And there was a recession in the 1980s. When were you born?
1980.
Okay. Well, when you were 4 years old.
68 for me. I was around a little longer.
I was at Virginia Tech and made the decision to go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And, I was painfully shy and could never have imagined becoming a professor, but I was heavily recruited, gave conference papers and got a signing bonus to go to Princeton, got early tenure, won national prizes. I've been cited by the Supreme Court. I was a hot shot, but it doesn't matter. Like, I won the highest prize in political science. If I was a white male, it would be the career prize. I mean, it's like the Nobel Prize for political scientists. Because I am black, I didn't get the same benefit, because you can discount it. It has to be affirmative action. There's no other way to account for it but affirmative action. And so that's the situation that affirmative action puts blacks in. And today, my position has always been that affirmative action should be race neutral and means tested. And what has always bothered me is that when it discriminates against particular groups, because I've always had a heart for that poor white male in Appalachia whose parents never finished the second grade, that's living in a hollow but has a brilliant mind. And so J.D. Vance, when he wrote about his relatives.
Elegy.
I understand that. And one of the things that really makes me different, and the adversity of diversity follows my book, Black Eye for America, How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House. It hurts me to see children shamed and bullied because of the color of their skin. The people that say it's wrong to discriminate against racial and ethnic minorities don't have a bit of problem discriminating against little white kids, sending them home crying about something their ancestors supposedly did. And I believe, I feel like God has called me for this hour to be a civil rights advocate for all people. And that's why I do what I do. And my books, the recent ones have been much shorter, and they're much shorter because I want them to be read, and they're written to be read by the average people. They have documentation. And the book that you have in your hand, Mike Toll, the co-author there, he is someone that has worked with me. He actually published the book. I had my own label, Be the People Books. And Mike used to be a sports writer for the Tennessean, and he was downsized. So you get rid of white men first. He's in his 60s. He's a white male. And so he sort of set up his own business. So he helped with the cover design and the pagination and all the work of how you make a book a book. That's Mike's expertise. And so we're a two-man show.
All getting it done. And we're excited about this book. Once again, it's The Adversity of Diversity. I just want to read the subtitle, How Real Unity Training Can Promote Healing in a Post-Affirmative Action World. And that leads me to my next question. So the critics will say, Dr. Swain, getting rid of affirmative action will cause our colleges, universities, and workplaces to lack any real diversity.
That's racism.
Explain that.
It's racism because there were blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans and everyone getting into college before affirmative action. In fact, Harvard University admitted its first black student in 1869. And in the early 1930s, W.E.B. Du Bois got his Ph.D. from Harvard. And the Journal of Blacks on Higher Education, based in New York City, every now and then they would do a journal where it looks at blacks throughout history. And I remember them doing a journal that had all of these black alumni from schools from New England and places that never discriminated. That they've always had black alumni, they just didn't have them in large numbers. And like Princeton and Harvard and places like that, they started admitting blacks, in the 1960s. Harvard was already admitting them, but with Princeton, 1960s, early on, even Roanoke College, my alma mater, they started admitting blacks in the 1960s. And so there were blacks that being admitted, but not in huge numbers. And when we look at, the aftermath of slavery and all of the stuff that we hear about slavery, a lot of what people focus on, about America's racism, but they overlook the fact that America had a birth date and was 1776. It wasn't 1619, but they overlook Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee Institute and George Washington Carver and the fact that Black Wall Street in Tulsa, we talk about how there was this prosperous black community, was burned to the ground. But we don't focus on what Bob Whitson would say we should focus on, the fact that black people had a community that was so prosperous that they were the envy of everyone around. And this was before government set-asides and affirmative action and whatever, but they were making it happen. And the first female millionaire, self-made millionaire, was a black woman. The lady, Madam Curry, the woman that came, no, that's not Madam. I'm going to forget her name, and then everyone's going to laugh at me. But the woman who came up with the straightening comb and how to straighten black hair. So, black people have been making it happen throughout the century. And even among some of the free blacks, the controversy involving Ron DeSantis and the Black History Program.
Sure. Here in Florida.
And so part of that controversy had to do with a statement that was made that some blacks, what was it about they benefited economically? But it had to do with the fact that they got trades that had value, and they were allowed to either work on the side or work independently. And so they made money because they had skills. And the first blacks that came to America, they were indentured servants. So after 7 years, they were set free, and they were set free with skills. And so many of the black elites, the Martha's Vineyard types, they are descendants of free blacks because they came from the indentured servants, they had skills, and they became very wealthy.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, and Heaven, if you talk about that, you are going to get in trouble culturally very quickly, and as many have discovered. As we push towards the end here, one of the things I actually want to ask both of you, and Rob, maybe I'll start with you, but from a Christian standpoint, how should we be looking at this? We recognize there's an issue of racial injustice that's taking place, that's being perpetrated in the name of racial justice. It's really really a question for both of you. So what, from a Christian standpoint, how should we be looking at this? Why is this concern to us as we talk about the city of God?
Well, first, let me say this so that I can redeem myself. The first black millionaire was Madam C.J. Walker.
Oh,
there you go.
Good.
All right. On the record.
Okay.
On the
Yes,
record.
on the
Like
record.
a good professor.
We got it. And she, as you see, those watching, she did it without notes. She didn't check her phone. She just
Well, I want
have to
Dr.
check my memory banks.
Yeah, we all got to work through the file cabinets.
I want Dr. Swain to have the last word on this, but I think as a pastor, it's important to understand that the gospel of Jesus Christ alone can bring the healing that our culture longs for. To say that our culture and our society is broken is a true statement.
Yep.
The problem is we're coming about it at 100 different ways. And the majority is saying we go about it through a system and a theory that is rooted in cultural Marxism.
Which is making it worse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is, and forgive me, but when I hear pastors say, well, there's certain things we can glean from theories like critical race theory, I say, are you kidding me? A theory rooted in Marxism, which is rooted in atheism. How in the world can we glean anything from that? When I read Ephesians 2, I read Paul exhorting the Ephesian church as saying that Christ has broken down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile. That was the hostile, that was the group that was most hostile to the Gentile community, the Jewish people in the first century. And Paul wants to remind them that wall of hostility has been broken down, not through critical race theory, not through Marxism, not through any of the other worldly ideas. Yeah, exactly. I'll go in a room and we'll give you training to be racially sensitive to one another. No, he said it was the gospel of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. The problem is, I wonder, do most Christians actually believe the gospel has the power to do that? Instead, we've privatized the Christian faith and we've allowed the secular elites to lead the charge in our colleges and universities, on entertainment and media, and of course in our government.
Well, I mean, I agree with all of that. And our seminaries have been infected with the Marxism through liberation theology and some of the things that have seeped into the seminaries.
Replace biblical justice with social justice.
Yes, and one of the things that's very troubling for me is I am now a Southern Baptist. But I came in as sort of charismatic. Oh, well, then you know that in 2009, they adopted a resolution that said that critical race theory and intersectionality could be used as analytical tools.
Wow.
To help us understand race. And to me, that was very shocking because the gospel of Jesus Christ has everything we need to understand race and to get along. There's no way you would turn to a Marxist theory rooted in conflict theory to be able to think you're going to get any kind of racial reconciliation. And I think so many pastors, when they do have black members, and some of the churches, Southern Baptists, that maybe they have only a few, maybe they have one family or two families, and I don't think that's racism. I think that we have different preferences for music, how long we think a church service should go, and
Sure.
There are reasons why we choose our churches, we choose our music, we choose our food, so we choose our churches. But sometimes pastors would defer to the racial and ethnic minorities, and we've sort of been groomed as minorities to have a chip on our shoulders. We can always find something wrong. And when people hearken back to slavery, I think a good pastor would show them those scriptures on forgiveness. And so, like, it's not a Baptist apologize all the time. Like the Southern Baptists, I've counted no less than 5 apologies, and I probably missed some for slavery and the mistakes that they have made. And to me, that's unbiblical, because if we believe that God forgives our sins, you don't have to keep repeatedly confessing and asking for forgiveness for the same sin of your ancestors. And I see that being done, and I believe that the social justice, that it was a very strategic Marxist plan to get into the churches. And when I teach my course this weekend, I will share the Cleon Skousen's 1958 with 45 current communist goals. And one was to infiltrate the church and move it away from the gospel of Jesus to social gospel. And that's what has been done.
Yep, absolutely. And you go even further back. Karl Marx said, if this movement is going to work, we're going to need to attack the educational system, the nuclear family, and the houses of worship. And
here we are.
Marxists for decades have been doing just that. Well, I am so grateful that you are here with us once again, Dr. Carol Swain, with her new book, The Adversity of Diversity. We'll get that on the camera there.
Forward from Alan Dershowitz, no less.
Forward by Alan Dershowitz, absolutely. How real unity training can promote healing in a post-affirmative action world. Also, we welcome you here this weekend for the Institute for Faith and Culture course on cultural Marxism. So really looking forward to that. But more importantly, just thank you that you are speaking truth to power and that you're not willing to back down, because these conversations are so important, as I said in the beginning, not just for the current generation, but for future generations to come. So God be with you in your ministry and in your calling.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
I want to thank you once again for listening to the City of God podcast and this episode where we interviewed Dr. Carol Swain. If you benefited from this interview, encouraged, inspired by it, we pray that you would pass this along to a family member, a friend that might benefit from hearing the topics that we discussed as we together explore what it means to be the people of the City of God, as we explore today's biggest cultural issues all through the lens of God's infallible word. We pray that you join us next time. And until then, may God richly bless you. The City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. Visit us at cityofgodpodcast.com to access all of our previous episodes. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or anywhere you get podcasts. A full video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.